What happens when you treat your father exactly like he treated you? My father, Roland, owned 17 car dealerships across 3 states. He had a house in Aspen, a condo in Miami, and a main estate with 8 bedrooms that sat empty because he lived alone. He was worth about $40 million depending on the market. We knew this because he told us constantly. He'd pull out his phone at dinner and show us his portfolio. "Look at that," he'd say. "That's what hard work gets you. My money. I earned every cent. Nobody helped me, and I'm not helping anybody." That included his kids. My brother Jason, my sister Diane, grew up watching other people's parents buy them school supplies, pay for college, and help with first apartments. Roland bought nothing. I worked at Subway at 14 to buy my own clothes. Jason delivered pizzas to pay for his broken tooth repair. Diane cleaned office buildings at night during high school to afford textbooks. Roland would watch us leave for our jobs and say the same thing every time. "Good. You're learning the value of money. When you make your own, you'll appreciate it." Meanwhile, he bought a new Porsche every year. Not because he needed it, but because he could. He'd park it in the driveway when we visited, keys sitting on the kitchen counter, making sure we saw what his money could buy. But never for us. Only for him. The breaking point came at Diane's wedding. She'd saved for 3 years, planned everything herself, and chose the cheapest options for everything. Roland showed up in a new Bentley, wearing a watch that cost more than the entire wedding. During his father of the bride speech, he actually said, "Diane planned this all herself, paid for it herself. I didn't give her a penny. That's how I raised my kids. To be independent. Some of you probably think I should have helped, but handouts create weakness." The other parents looked horrified. Diane smiled because that's what she always did, but I saw her hand shaking around her champagne glass. That night, I started planning. Roland had one weakness. He was obsessed with exclusive things. Private clubs, limited releases, and invitation-only events. He needed everyone to know he had access to things they didn't. So I created something he couldn't have. I started an investment fund called Legacy Partners. I made a website, created marketing materials, and printed glossy brochures. The hook was simple. Minimum buy-in of $50 million, but the first round was invitation only, and invitations were hereditary. You could only get in if your children vouched for you. I leaked information about it to his golf buddies. Told them my kids were part of the founding board, that we were selecting 10 families for the initial round. The returns we were projecting were insane, but believable if you understood the markets we were targeting. Technology patents, international real estate, and emerging markets. Everything Roland loved. Within a week, Roland called me. "Heard about your fund," he said casually. "Sounds interesting." I kept my voice neutral. "Yeah, it's going well. We're almost full." He cleared his throat. "So, how does someone get information about joining?" I explained the children vouching requirement. He laughed. "That's ridiculous. What do kids know about money?" "Everything they learned from their parents," I said. Or didn't learn. The line went quiet. 2 days later, he called again. "This Legacy Partners thing. My golf buddy Richard got in. His kids vouched for him immediately." "Must be nice," I said. "Having kids who want to help you access opportunities." Another long pause. The calls kept coming. Roland started mentioning how successful his dealerships were, how much money he had to invest, and how he was looking for new opportunities. But I never offered. Neither did Jason nor Diane. He'd trained us well. We didn't help anybody, not even him. 3 weeks in, Roland invited all 3 of us to dinner at the most expensive steakhouse in town. He never invited us to dinner. He never paid for our food. But there he was, ordering $100 steaks, talking about family and legacy and building things together. So about this fund, he finally said over dessert, "I think it would be good for all of us if I got involved." "Why would it be good for us?" Diane asked. "We're already on the board. We don't need investors. We need the right investors. People whose children believe they deserve to be part of building something special." Roland's face changed. "Are you seriously going to block me from this opportunity? Your own father?" Jason leaned forward. "Did you seriously block us from every opportunity our whole lives? Your own children?" Roland looked between us. "That was different. I was teaching you to be independent." "And you succeeded," I said. "We're so independent we don't need you at all. For anything, including this." He sat back in his chair. The check came. For the first time in my life, I watched Roland pay for our dinner. He thought it would change something. It didn't. A month later, Roland called me crying. I'd never heard my father cry before. Not when his own mother died, not when his business partner had a heart attack in the office, Not even when he broke his arm falling off a ladder at 68. But here he was on the phone, making these awful choking sounds between words. He kept saying he understood now, really understood what it felt like to watch someone have everything while you had nothing. He said watching his golf buddies get into legacy partners while his own kids blocked him out made him feel small and worthless. His voice broke when he said worthless, and I felt something twist in my chest. I didn't say anything, just held the phone pressed against my ear so hard it hurt. My knuckles went white around the phone case. He talked about Diane's wedding, how proud he'd been of her for planning everything herself, how he thought he was teaching us to be strong. He said he watched us leave for our jobs as teenagers and felt satisfied that we were learning what he learned, that nobody would hand us anything. But now he realized we were leaving because we had to, because he chose not to help us, and we probably hated him every time we walked out that door. His voice cracked again. He said he was ashamed, that he wanted to make things right, that he'd do whatever it took to prove he'd changed. I stood in my kitchen staring at the coffee maker while my father cried and apologized. Finally, I told him I needed time to think about all this, and I hung up. My heart was pounding, so hard I could hear it in my ears. I called Jason and Diane right away, got them both on the line together. Jason answered on the second ring, Diane on the fourth. I told them Roland had just called me crying and apologizing for everything. Jason laughed, this short, bitter sound. He said it was obviously manipulation, another game to get what he wanted. Roland was playing us, making us feel guilty so we'd let him into the fund. Diane didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then she asked quietly if we'd ever thought about whether what we were doing might be cruel. Jason exploded. He asked if she was serious, if she'd forgotten about working in the office buildings at night during high school while Roland drove past in his Porsche. Diane said she hadn't forgotten anything, but maybe making an old man desperate and broken wasn't the victory we thought it was. Jason told her she was going soft, that she always did this, always wanted to forgive him before he'd actually changed. Diane's voice got sharper. She said maybe the problem was that Jason wanted revenge more than he wanted a father. The line went quiet. I said we should all think about it and talk tomorrow when we weren't so worked up. Jason hung up without saying goodbye. Diane sighed and said goodnight, and then she was gone too. The next morning, someone knocked on my apartment door at 7:30. I was still in my pajamas, hadn't even made coffee yet. I looked through the peephole and saw Roland standing there. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were red and puffy, his hair messy instead of perfectly styled like usual. But what really shocked me was what he was wearing and what he was driving. Through my living room window, I could see an old gray sedan parked on the street, something from the early 2000s with a dent in the bumper. Roland was wearing regular jeans, the kind you buy at Target, and a plain blue shirt. No designer labels, no expensive watch, no leather shoes that cost more than my rent. He knocked again. I opened the door and he asked if we could talk, really talk, not the surface stuff we usually did. Something about how tired he looked, how small he seemed standing there in normal clothes, made me step aside and let him in. He sat at my kitchen table while I made coffee. His hands shook when he picked up the mug. He started talking about his childhood, stuff he'd never mentioned before. He said his father left when he was 6, just walked out one day and never came back. His mother worked 3 jobs trying to keep them fed and housed. He remembered being hungry a lot, remembered wearing shoes with holes in them to the school, remembered other kids making fun of his clothes. He put himself through community college working nights at a gas station, sleeping 4 hours a night, terrified every single day that he'd end up poor forever. He said the fear of poverty lived in his bones, that even now with $40 million he sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, convinced he'd lost everything. He looked at me across the table. His eyes were wet again. He said he knew none of this excused what he did to us, but maybe it explained it a little. I asked him why he flaunted his wealth if he was so scared of losing it. Why show us his portfolio at dinner? Why buy a new Porsche every year? Why wear that expensive watch to Diane's wedding? He was quiet for a minute. Then he said it was about proving to himself that he'd escaped. Every car, every house, every expensive thing was proof that he wasn't that hungry kid anymore. He needed to see the evidence constantly, needed everyone else to see it too, needed to convince himself over and over that he was safe. The portfolio updates at dinner weren't about showing off to us, though that's what it looked like. They were about showing himself that the numbers were still there, that he was still rich, that he was still safe. He said when he finally made real money, the fear didn't go away like he thought it would. It just changed shape. Every dollar he spent felt like a step back toward poverty. He convinced himself that helping us financially would make us weak and dependent like his father was. His hands shook worse when he talked about his father. He said he was wrong about everything, that he damaged us trying to protect us from damage that was only in his head. Roland left after about an hour. He asked if we could talk again soon, and I said maybe. I watched him drive away in that old sedan, and then I sat on my couch trying to figure out what I was feeling. Part of me wanted to dismiss everything he said as manipulation, another trick to get into Legacy Partners. But another part recognized real pain in his story, pain that matched the pain I'd carried my whole life. I thought about being 14 at Subway, making sandwiches for $7 an hour while Roland sat in his big empty house surrounded by expensive things, probably feeling just as alone and scared as I did. It didn't make what he did okay. It didn't erase Diane's shaking hand at her wedding or Jason's broken tooth or all those years of feeling worthless. But it made him seem human instead of just cruel. I picked up my phone and called Rose Pina, the therapist I started seeing 2 months ago when the revenge plan started messing with my sleep. She had an opening that afternoon. Rose's office smelled like lavender. She sat across from me in her usual chair and asked how I was doing. I told her about Roland's call, his visit, his story about growing up poor. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked what I wanted to accomplish with Legacy Partners. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't know. I'd wanted to make Roland feel excluded and desperate, wanted him to understand what it felt like to be on the outside looking in. Mission accomplished. He was desperate. He was broken. He'd cried on the phone and shown up at my apartment looking like he hadn't slept in days. Rose leaned forward. She said I'd succeeded in my goal, so now I needed to decide what came next. Did I want revenge, or did I want a relationship with my father? Because I probably couldn't have both. If I kept going with the fake fund, kept pushing him further into desperation, I was choosing revenge. If I wanted any chance at a real relationship, I had to stop. She said the choice was mine, but I needed to make it consciously, not just keep going because I'd started. I sat there for the rest of the session trying to figure out what I actually wanted. That evening, Maxwell Stevenson called. His voice sounded weird, uncomfortable in a way I'd never heard from him. He said Roland had come to him earlier that day, crying again, asking why Maxwell's kids vouched for him, but Roland's own children wouldn't. Maxwell said he'd lied and told Roland his kids believed in him, that they wanted him to be part of something special. But sitting across from Roland, watching him cry about being rejected by his own family, made Maxwell feel terrible. He said he wasn't sure he could keep up the pretense anymore. Roland seemed genuinely broken, not just upset about missing an investment opportunity, but actually devastated about his relationship with us. Maxwell asked if maybe we'd made our point. I told him I'd think about it and let him know. After I hung up, I sat in the dark in my living room for a long time. The satisfaction I'd felt watching Roland beg for access to the fake fund was completely gone. Now I just felt tired and confused and maybe a little bit ashamed. I texted Jason and Diane that we needed to talk, and we met at a coffee shop near my apartment the next morning. Jason showed up first, already drinking black coffee and looking like he hadn't slept. Diane arrived 10 minutes later with red eyes, and I could tell she'd been crying. We sat at a corner table away from other people, and I told them about Roland's visit, his story about growing up poor and how broken he seemed. Jason's face hardened immediately. He set his coffee down hard enough that some spilled on the table. He said Roland was playing us, that this was exactly what manipulators do when they're not getting what they want. They make themselves look pathetic and vulnerable so you feel sorry for them and give in. Jason said he'd seen this pattern his whole life, Roland switching between intimidation and manipulation depending on what worked. Diane wiped her eyes and said, maybe Roland's pain was real, that people can genuinely suffer even when they've caused suffering themselves. Jason turned on her fast, asking if she was seriously defending the man who humiliated her at her own wedding. Diane's voice shook when she said no, she wasn't defending him, but we deliberately set out to make him feel excluded and desperate, and we succeeded. Now we're watching an old man break down, and maybe that makes us cruel too. Jason stood up so fast his chair scraped loud across the floor. People turned to look at us. He said we worked minimum wage jobs as kids while Roland bought Porsches, that Diane cleaned office buildings at night to afford textbooks, that I made sandwiches at Subway for $7 an hour. He asked if we forgot all that, if one crying phone call erased decades of neglect. Diane started crying harder. She said she remembered everything, every single moment of feeling worthless and excluded. But we're adults now with decent lives and careers we built ourselves. Continuing to torture an old man who's clearly suffering says more about us than him. Jason grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. He turned back and said if we wanted to forgive Roland and play happy family, go ahead. But he wasn't done making him pay. The door slammed behind him. Diane put her head in her hands and sobbed. I sat there not knowing what to say, watching my sister fall apart while other customers pretended not to stare. 2 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a man's voice said his name was Cyrus Moser, that he was Roland's business partner of 20 years. He asked if we could talk, said Roland asked him to reach out because Roland was too ashamed to call me again himself. I almost hung up, but something in his voice made me stay on the line. Cyrus said he'd known our family for 2 decades, watched us grow up from a distance, and he needed to tell me something about Roland that might change my perspective. He said Roland has been secretly paying off medical debts for former dealership employees for years, covering hospital bills and treatment costs without ever publicizing it or using it for tax benefits. I sat down on my couch, confused. Cyrus explained that 15 years ago, Roland set up a private fund specifically for this purpose. He's paid over $2 million in medical bills for employees and their families, people who worked for him and couldn't afford their healthcare costs. Cyrus said Roland swore him to secrecy because he didn't want people thinking he'd gone soft or that employees could start depending on him for help. The contradiction hit me hard. Roland wouldn't help his own kids buy school supplies but secretly paid millions in medical bills for employees. Cyrus said he's telling me this because Roland is a complicated man who did real damage to his children, but isn't the monster we think he is. He mentioned that Roland's been in his office crying several times recently, completely broken down in ways Cyrus has never seen in 20 years of partnership. Then Cyrus said something that made my stomach drop. Roland is 72 years old with heart problems, and the stress of this situation with his children could literally kill him. The doctors have warned him about his blood pressure and stress levels. Cyrus asked if I understood what he was saying, if I grasped that this revenge might actually end with Roland having a heart attack. I hung up feeling more confused than I'd felt in my entire life. I called Rose and asked for an emergency session. She fit me in that afternoon. I sat in her lavender-scented office and told her everything Cyrus said about the medical fund and Roland's heart problems. Rose listened without interrupting, then asked what I was feeling. I said I didn't know, that I was angry and guilty and confused all at the same time. She said people can be genuinely damaged by their past and still be responsible for the damage they cause others. Roland's childhood trauma explains his behavior, but doesn't excuse it. I'm allowed to feel sympathy for his pain and anger about my own pain simultaneously. Those feelings don't cancel each other out. Rose leaned forward and said the question isn't whether Roland deserves sympathy or punishment, but what I want my relationship with him to look like going forward. Do I want revenge or do I want a father? Because those are different paths with different outcomes. She said I need to decide consciously instead of just continuing down the revenge path because I started it. I left her office with more questions than answers, but at least the questions felt clearer. The next evening, someone knocked on my apartment door. I opened it to find Catherine Groves standing there looking angry. Catherine is a family friend who's known us since we were kids, someone who used to bring us cookies when Roland wouldn't buy groceries. She walked past me into my apartment without being invited. She turned and said she needed to tell me something bluntly because nobody else would. What we're doing to Roland is cruel, and the whole community is talking about how his own children are torturing him. She said she understands we're hurt, that Roland was a terrible father in many ways, but this revenge makes us look petty and vindictive. I started to defend myself, but Catherine held up her hand. She said Roland came to her house last week and broke down completely at her kitchen table. He told her he ruined his relationship with his children and doesn't know how to fix it. Catherine watched a proud man who never showed weakness sob like a child, and she thinks we need to know that our revenge has accomplished its goal. If we keep going now, we're not seeking justice anymore. We're just being sadistic. She left without saying goodbye, and I stood in my apartment doorway watching her walk to her car. After Catherine left, I sat on my couch in the dark for a long time. Our private revenge had become public knowledge. People were judging us, taking sides, and the story was changing from Roland was a terrible father to his children are cruel. I thought about the satisfaction I felt 6 weeks ago when Roland first called begging for access to the fake fund. That feeling was completely gone now, replaced by something that felt uncomfortably like shame. People I'd known my whole life were looking at me differently, and maybe they were right to. I picked up my phone and called Maxwell. He answered on the second ring. I told him he could stop pretending to be in the legacy fund, that I was ending this. Maxwell let out a long breath and said he was relieved. He admitted that several other golf buddies have been asking him detailed questions about the fund, and he's been making up information that's getting harder to track. He's had to invent fake quarterly reports and investment strategies, and he was worried someone would catch him in a lie. Then Maxwell said something that hit me hard. He asked gently if I'd considered that maybe I'd made my point, and it was time to end this before real damage happened. His voice was kind but firm, and I realized he was right. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, unable to shut off my brain. Roland's story about growing up poor kept playing on repeat in my head. I remembered being 14 years old, coming home from my shift at Subway smelling like bread and pickles, seeing that new Porsche in the driveway. The anger I felt back then was so pure and simple. He had money and wouldn't share it with us, end of story. But now I kept picturing him sitting alone in that 8-bedroom house, surrounded by all those expensive things, still feeling like the scared kid who went to bed hungry. Maybe every time he bought another luxury car or checked his portfolio, he was trying to prove to himself that he'd escaped poverty. Maybe the fear never went away no matter how many millions he accumulated. It didn't make what he did to us okay. Nothing could make that okay. But it made it sad in a way I wasn't prepared for. I thought about Diane at her wedding, hand shaking around her champagne glass while Roland bragged about not helping her. I thought about Jason delivering pizzas with a broken tooth because his own father wouldn't pay for dental work. Those memories still made me angry, but now they made me sad too, because Roland was probably so trapped in his own fear that he couldn't see what he was doing to us. My phone buzzed just after midnight. Jason's name lit up the screen. I answered and immediately heard the slur in his voice. "Diane wants to quit," he said without greeting. "She told me tonight she thinks we should end the whole legacy thing." I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. Jason's words tumbled out fast and angry. He went on about how Diane was betraying us, how we'd planned this together and now she was going soft. He listed every single time Roland had hurt us, his voice getting louder with each memory. The Porsche in the driveway, the portfolio updates at dinner, Diane's wedding speech, my Subway uniform, his broken tooth, the country club memberships Roland flaunted while we worked minimum wage jobs. I listened to him rant for 10 minutes straight before I finally understood what was really happening. Jason wasn't angry at Diane. He was angry at the idea of letting go of his anger at Roland, because that anger was the only thing protecting him from the pain underneath. As long as he could stay mad, he didn't have to feel hurt. "We need to talk about this when you're sober," I told him. Jason went quiet for a moment. Then he said something that broke my heart. "If I stop being angry at him, what do I have left? Just the fact that my own father didn't think I was worth helping. I'd rather be angry." He hung up before I could respond. I texted Diane right away, and she replied immediately like she'd been waiting for me to reach out. She suggested we all meet at her house in the morning. I barely slept the rest of the night. The three of us sat around Diane's kitchen table at 9 in the morning. Jason looked rough, his eyes bloodshot, and his hands shaking slightly as he drank the coffee Diane made him. I told them everything Cyrus had said about Roland's secret medical fund, the $2 million he'd spent over 15 years paying employees' medical bills without telling anyone. Jason's face went through several different emotions while I talked. Shock first, then confusion, then something that looked almost like betrayal, like Roland keeping this secret generosity was another way of hurting us. "It doesn't change anything," Jason said quietly, but his voice didn't have the conviction it usually did when he talked about Roland. "He paid strangers' medical bills but wouldn't fix my tooth. That's somehow worse." Diane wrapped her hands around her own coffee mug. "What are we actually trying to accomplish now? Roland is clearly suffering. We wanted him to feel excluded and powerless, and he does. So what happens next?" We sat in silence for a moment. The question hung in the air between us, heavy and uncomfortable. I realized I didn't have a good answer. Jason stared into his coffee. Diane looked out the window at her backyard. None of us wanted to be the first to admit that maybe we'd gone far enough. We ended up talking for 3 hours. We went through our childhoods piece by piece, examining every memory where Roland had hurt us. Jason talked about how working as a pizza delivery driver at 15 made him feel worthless, like he wasn't even worth the cost of basic dental care to his own father. Diane described planning her wedding around the cheapest possible options because she was terrified of seeming like she needed help, even though she desperately wanted Roland to offer. I admitted that every time I saw Roland's Porsche in the driveway while I was wearing my Subway uniform, I felt like he was deliberately showing me that his comfort mattered more than mine. But then we started talking about what we actually wanted from Roland now. Jason went quiet for a long time before he said he'd wanted Roland to feel as powerless as we did growing up. And that's happened. He's been begging us for access to something he can't have, just like we begged him for help and got nothing. Diane said she'd wanted him to understand what exclusion felt like, to know how it feels when the people who should care about you most shut you out deliberately. And he does understand that now. I realized what I'd really wanted all along was for Roland to apologize and acknowledge the damage he'd caused. His crying phone call had been exactly that, even if I hadn't recognized it at the time. So we'd each gotten what we wanted from this revenge. The question was what we did with that success. Diane brought up the elephant in the room that we'd all been avoiding. Legacy Partners is completely fake. At some point, that truth is going to come out. When it does, any progress we might make toward having a real relationship with Roland will be destroyed instantly, because he'll know we deliberately deceived and humiliated him. The revenge that felt so satisfying 6 weeks ago when this started now felt like a bomb waiting to explode. Jason suggested we could just let the fund fade away naturally. Tell people it didn't work out, that the market conditions changed or the founding partners decided to go in a different direction. We never have to admit it was fake. But Diane shook her head. Living with that lie means never having an honest relationship with Roland. Our whole family has been built on dishonesty for decades. Roland lying about his reasons for not helping us lying about understanding his philosophy, everyone pretending we were fine when we weren't. She was tired of it. She wanted something real, even if real meant painful. I agreed with her, though the thought of confessing the truth to Roland made my stomach hurt. How do you tell your father you created an elaborate fake investment fund just to watch him beg? I met with Rose 2 days later. I'd been seeing her weekly since the legacy thing started affecting my sleep, and she'd become someone I trusted to be honest with me even when the honesty hurt. I explained the situation to her. The revenge had worked. Roland was suffering and remorseful. But now we had to decide whether to come clean about the fake fund or let it fade away and live with the lie forever. Rose leaned back in her chair and asked me what I wanted my relationship with Roland to look like 5 years from now. I'd never thought about it that way. I'd been so focused on making him pay for the past that I hadn't considered what kind of future I actually wanted. If I want a real relationship with him, I said slowly, it has to be built on honesty, even when that honesty is painful. Rose nodded. The revenge gave you temporary power and satisfaction, but it can't give you what you actually need, which is a father who sees you and values you. That kind of relationship can only exist if you're both willing to be honest about who you are and what you've done, even the ugly parts. She was right. Keeping the legacy secret meant keeping Roland at arm's length forever. Telling him the truth meant risking his anger and hurt, but it also meant the possibility of something real. I left her office knowing what I had to do, even though every part of me wanted to avoid it. I called Roland and asked him to meet me for dinner, just the two of us. He sounded surprised but hopeful when he agreed. I picked a quiet restaurant on the edge of town, the kind of place where you could have a private conversation without the whole community watching. My heart pounded the entire drive there. I kept rehearsing what I was going to say, but nothing sounded right. How do you confess to deliberately humiliating your own father? Roland was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table. He looked hopeful when he saw me, and that hope made what I was about to do so much harder. He'd probably been thinking this dinner meant I was ready to vouch for him to join Legacy. He probably thought his crying phone call and honest conversation about his childhood had changed things between us. He wasn't wrong, but not in the way he expected. We ordered food neither of us would eat, made small talk about the weather and the restaurant and nothing that mattered. Finally, I couldn't put it off anymore. I need to confess something, I told him. I watched his face change as I started explaining. Legacy Partners doesn't exist. It never existed. I created the whole thing as revenge. Roland sat completely still while I told him the entire story. I explained how I'd made the website, created the marketing materials, printed the glossy brochures, how I'd leaked information to his golf buddies through Maxwell, who'd agreed to pretend he was in the fund, how we'd designed the hereditary voucher system specifically to target his obsession with exclusive access, how we'd watched him call and beg and humiliate himself for access to something that was never real. I told him I'd wanted him to feel excluded and powerless like we did growing up, to understand what it felt like when the people who should help you most refused to. And I'd succeeded. His face went through shock first, his mouth opening slightly like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then hurt, his eyes going wet and his jaw clenching. Then anger, a flash of the old Roland who would have yelled and walked out. But finally his expression settled into something that looked like understanding, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. He was quiet for a long time. Our food arrived and sat untouched between us. The waiter asked if everything was okay, and we both said yes automatically, even though nothing was okay. Finally, Roland spoke. "I deserve this. What you did to me is exactly what I did to you for decades. The cruelty of it actually helps me understand how much damage I caused, because feeling this humiliated and manipulated is unbearable." He looked directly at me. "Did you tell me the truth because you felt guilty, or because you want to try having a real relationship?" I didn't know how to answer that question. Both felt true at the same time. The guilt was real, sitting heavy in my chest like a stone. But so was the curiosity about who Roland actually was when he wasn't performing wealth or defending his choices. I told him both things were true, that I felt terrible about what we'd done, but also wanted to understand him beyond the father who'd spent decades proving he didn't need us. Roland nodded slowly, his eyes still wet but focused on me with an attention I'd never experienced from him before. He said he understood that he'd spent his whole life protecting himself from vulnerability, and it had cost him everything that actually mattered. He asked if we could try building something real, starting from this moment of painful honesty instead of pretending the past didn't exist. I said yes, even though I had no idea what that would look like, or if it was even possible after everything we'd done to each other. Jason's meeting with Roland happened 3 days later at a diner near Jason's apartment. I wasn't there, but Jason called me right after, his voice tight with emotions he couldn't name. He said he'd walked in planning to enjoy watching Roland squirm, to take satisfaction in the pain we'd caused him. But sitting across from our father in that booth, watching him try to drink coffee with shaking hands, Jason felt something shift inside him. Roland had listened to the whole Legacy Partners confession without interrupting, his face going pale, but his posture staying still. When Jason finished talking, Roland said he deserved every bit of the humiliation, that he'd taught us to be ruthless, and we'd learned the lesson well. Then he asked the same question he'd asked me, whether Jason wanted revenge or a relationship, because those two things couldn't exist in the same space. Jason told me he'd said he didn't know yet, that the anger was still too big to see past, but he'd think about it. Roland had nodded, paid for both their meals without making a show of it, and left Jason sitting in that booth trying to figure out what he actually wanted. Diane's conversation happened 2 days after Jason's, and she called me crying before she even got home. She said she'd gone into the meeting angry, ready to make Roland understand exactly how much damage his wedding speech had caused, but the moment she started explaining about Legacy Partners, she'd broken down. All the years of planning her wedding around the cheapest options, of being terrified to ask for help, of watching other brides get support from their fathers while she got public humiliation, came pouring out. Roland had cried too, actually sobbed sitting across from her at the coffee shop, and told her he'd thought he was showing pride in her independence when really he was broadcasting that she wasn't worth helping. He'd said the same thing to her that he'd said to Jason and me, that he deserved the revenge but wanted to try building something healthier if she was willing. Diane told me she'd said yes immediately, that she was tired of being angry and wanted to see if they could have a real relationship. But she also said she was scared we'd judge her for forgiving too easily, for being soft when Jason was still holding onto his anger like armor. Catherine called me a week after all 3 conversations had happened. Her voice was careful when she said she'd heard what we did, that Roland had told her about Legacy Partners being fake and about us confessing the truth to him. She said she thought the revenge was wrong, that deliberately humiliating someone was cruel no matter what they'd done to deserve it. But she also respected that we'd told the truth instead of letting the lie continue forever. She mentioned Roland had called her crying again, but this time the crying was different. He wasn't crying about being excluded or manipulated. He was crying about the relationship he could have had with us if he hadn't been so damaged and afraid. Catherine said she'd known Roland for 30 years, and she'd never heard him talk about emotional damage or fear before, that he was actually trying to change instead of just defending himself. She thought we should know that whatever we'd done had cracked something open in him that needed to break. I thanked her and hung up, then sat on my couch staring at my phone for 20 minutes. The revenge had worked exactly as planned. We'd made Roland feel excluded, desperate, and humiliated. We'd forced him to beg and manipulate and show us the ugly side of his obsession with exclusive access. But we'd also done something we hadn't planned. We'd created a situation so painful that it forced all of us to be honest for the first time in our lives. The fake fund was cruel, but it had led to conversations we never would have had otherwise. I didn't know if that made it worth it, or just made us all complicit in perpetuating the family's cycle of emotional damage. Roland called me 2 weeks after the confessions and asked if the 3 of us would meet with him. His voice sounded different, less defensive and more tentative, like he wasn't sure we'd say yes. We agreed to meet at a neutral restaurant, none of us ready to go to his house yet. When we arrived, Roland was already there and he looked older somehow, like the stress of everything had aged him in ways his money couldn't fix. He thanked us for coming, then said something that shocked all of us into silence. He wanted us to try family therapy together, if we were willing. He'd already found a therapist who worked with estranged families trying to reconcile, and he'd made an appointment for the following week. Jason's face went through surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been hope. Diane reached across the table and squeezed Roland's hand, tears already starting. I just nodded, too stunned to speak, because Roland asking for help with anything was something I'd never imagined possible. The first therapy session was brutal in ways I wasn't prepared for. The therapist was a woman in her 50s named Dr. Franco, and she didn't let any of us hide behind polite distance or careful words. She made us talk about specific memories, specific moments when Roland's choices had damaged us, and specific ways we'd retaliated. Decades of pain and anger came spilling out in that office, things we'd never said directly to each other because saying them out loud would make them too real. Jason talked about delivering pizzas at 15 to pay for his broken tooth, about feeling like Roland's love was conditional on financial independence. Diane described planning her wedding around the cheapest options because asking for help felt like admitting she was weak. I explained working at Subway at 14 and watching Roland park new Porsches in the driveway, the message clear that his money was for him alone. Roland listened to all of it without defending himself, his face showing pain but not surprise, like he'd always known the damage existed, but had never let himself see it clearly. In our fourth session, Dr. Franco asked Roland to talk about watching us work as teenagers. He was quiet for a long time before he started speaking, his voice soft and almost confused. He said he'd felt proud watching us leave for our jobs, that he'd thought he was teaching us self-reliance and the value of hard work. He'd believed we were learning important lessons about independence and earning what we had. Dr. Franco asked him what he thought we were actually learning, and Roland's face changed as he processed the question. She walked him through it slowly, asking what message a 14-year-old receives when their wealthy father watches them leave for minimum wage work instead of offering help. Roland's voice broke when he finally understood that his fear of creating dependent children had actually created children who felt worthless to him, who believed they didn't matter enough to help. Watching him grasp that reality was devastating, his whole face crumpling as he realized the gap between his intentions and the actual impact of his choices. Jason struggled the most in therapy, his anger so deep it took 3 sessions before he could stay in the room for the full hour. He'd walk out halfway through, too angry to keep listening, and Roland would sit there looking broken but not trying to stop him. But gradually something shifted in Jason. In the 6th session, he started talking about how working at 14 had shaped every relationship he'd had since then, how he'd learned that love was conditional on not needing anything from anyone. He described pushing away girlfriends who wanted to help him, refusing support from friends, building his entire identity around not depending on anyone because depending on people meant they'd prove you weren't worth helping. Roland listened without defending himself, without explaining his intentions or his childhood, just absorbing Jason's pain with tears running down his face. That was new, Roland listening without making it about himself, and I saw Jason notice the difference. Diane's breakthrough came in the 8th session when Dr. Franco asked her to talk about her wedding. Diane's voice shook as she explained planning everything around the cheapest options, choosing the least expensive venue and decorations and food, because she was terrified of seeming like she needed help. She desperately wanted Roland to offer support, had hoped right up until the wedding day that he'd surprise her with some gesture that showed she mattered. Instead, he'd given that speech about her independence, about how he hadn't given her a penny, and it felt like public confirmation that she wasn't worth helping. She'd smiled through it because that's what she always did, but inside she'd felt like he was telling everyone that she didn't matter enough to him to break his rules. Roland broke down hearing this, actually sobbing in the therapist's office, finally understanding how his actions had translated to his children. Dr. Franco let him cry for a while before asking what he wanted to say to Diane, and Roland told her he was sorry, that he'd been so focused on not creating weakness that he'd missed every opportunity to show love. Dr. Franco asked each of us what we needed from Roland to move forward. The answers surprised me with how simple they were, how basic the requests sounded when we finally said them out loud. Jason needed Roland to acknowledge that making a 14-year-old financially independent wasn't character building, it was neglect. He needed to hear Roland say that parents are supposed to help their children, that offering support doesn't create weakness, but shows that the child matters. Diane needed Roland to understand that offering help isn't creating dependence, it's demonstrating love and care. She needed him to see that his fear of making us weak had actually made us feel worthless. I needed Roland to stop thinking about money as a measure of worth, to see us as people he valued beyond our ability to survive without him. Roland listened to each request and acknowledged them without defending himself or explaining his reasoning. He just said he understood, and he'd work on changing those patterns. Roland started making changes after that session, small shifts that felt significant because they were so unlike him. He called each of us once a week just to talk, not about money or business or investments, but about our actual lives. He asked about my job, what I was reading, how I was feeling about everything happening between us. He asked Jason about his baseball league and his apartment and his day-to-day life. He asked Diane about her pregnancy plans and her hopes for becoming a mother. The conversations were awkward at first because we'd never had this kind of relationship, never talked about feelings or daily life or anything that wasn't transactional. But it got easier over weeks, the calls becoming less stiff and more natural. Roland was learning how to be a father instead of just a wealthy man who happened to have children, and we were learning how to let him try. 3 months after I'd confessed about legacy partners, Roland called and asked if we'd come to his house for dinner. That request alone was unusual, but then he added that he wanted to cook for us, which was shocking because none of us had ever seen Roland cook anything. We arrived at his estate that evening not knowing what to expect, and found him in the kitchen surrounded by chaos. He was attempting to make lasagna from scratch, the counter covered in sauce and cheese and pasta, his expensive shirt splattered with tomato. He was laughing at himself, actually laughing at the mess he'd made, in a way I'd never witnessed before. He looked up when we walked in and grinned, admitting he'd watched 6 different cooking videos and still managed to disaster the whole thing. Diane started helping immediately, showing him how to layer the pasta properly, while Jason grabbed beers from the fridge and I set the table. We worked together in that kitchen for an hour, and it felt more like family than anything we'd experienced in our entire lives. The lasagna came out better than expected, a little burned on the edges, but tasting rich and good in a way that made the kitchen chaos worthwhile. We sat at Roland's dining table, the same table where he used to show us his portfolio on his phone, but tonight it held mismatched plates and a pan of homemade food instead of expensive takeout. Roland served us himself, scooping generous portions onto each plate, and I watched him move around the table with an ease I'd never seen before. He sat down and looked at the 3 of us, his hands folded on the table, and started talking about something I didn't expect. He'd been thinking about the employee medical fund that Cyrus mentioned, the one he'd kept secret for 15 years, and he realized something that made him uncomfortable. He could be generous with strangers, could pay millions in medical bills for people he barely knew, but he couldn't help his own children with basic things like school supplies or dental work. The realization sat heavy in the room, and Roland's voice got quiet when he said he understood now that it wasn't about teaching us independence, it was about protecting himself from vulnerability. He paused, picked at his lasagna, then told us he wanted to do something different going forward. He was setting up education funds for each of us, not for us to use now, but for our future kids, our grandchildren who didn't exist yet. The money would be there when we needed it, held in trust, no strings attached. It wasn't about us needing his money now, he said, but about him wanting to contribute to his future grandchildren's lives in ways he never contributed to ours. Diane's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and Jason stared at Roland like he was trying to figure out if this was another manipulation. But Roland just sat there, looking smaller somehow despite the expensive house around us, waiting for our response. The silence stretched until Jason finally spoke, his voice harder than the moment seemed to require. He asked the question we'd all been thinking, why Roland could do this now, but couldn't when we were kids working minimum wage jobs to afford basic necessities. Roland set down his fork and looked at Jason directly, not avoiding the question or deflecting like he would have months ago. He explained that therapy had helped him see something he'd never understood about himself, that his fear of poverty wasn't really about money at all. It was fear of vulnerability, fear of admitting that we mattered more than his bank account, because everyone he'd ever mattered to had abandoned him. His father left when he was 6, his mother died when he was 19, and he'd built his entire life around never needing anyone or letting anyone need him. Helping us would have meant admitting we were more important than his money, and that terrified him in ways he couldn't articulate until therapy forced him to look at it. He said it wasn't an excuse, just an explanation, and his hands shook slightly as he talked. Jason's face went through several expressions, anger and confusion, and something that might have been understanding, before he looked down at his plate. The explanation made sense in a way that felt both satisfying and sad, because it meant Roland's cruelty came from damage rather than malice, and that was somehow harder to hate. Diane set down her fork and wiped her mouth with her napkin, the movement slow and deliberate, like she was buying time to figure out what to say. She looked at Roland, then at me and Jason, then back at Roland before she spoke. She told us she was pregnant, the words coming out flat and factual, and the room went completely still. She'd found out 2 weeks ago and hadn't been sure she wanted to share the news with Roland, hadn't known if she wanted him involved in her child's life given everything that happened between us. But sitting here watching him try to cook lasagna and talk about education funds and admit his failures, she thought maybe there was space for him to be a grandfather if he wanted that role. Roland's eyes filled with tears immediately, his face crumbling in a way I'd only seen once before when he called me crying about the fund. He stood up from the table, walked around to Diane's chair and asked if he could hug her. She nodded and he pulled her up gently, holding her like she might break, crying into her shoulder. He said he wanted to do better with his grandchildren than he did with his children, wanted to be present and loving and actually helpful instead of emotionally absent and cruel. But he understood if she didn't trust him with that role yet, if she needed time or boundaries or proof that he'd really changed. Diane hugged him back and said they could start small and see how it goes. Maybe he could come to doctor's appointments or help set up the nursery, and they'd figure out the rest as they went. Roland nodded against her shoulder, still crying, and Jason looked away like the emotion was too much to watch directly. I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of anger that had been tight for so long, and I realized this was what I'd wanted from the beginning. Not revenge, not humiliation, but acknowledgement and effort, and the possibility of something different. The next few months moved in a strange rhythm of progress and setbacks, good days mixed with hard ones, as we figured out what a relationship with Roland could actually look like. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments when old patterns emerged, when Roland said something thoughtless about money or independence, and we all tensed up. Jason struggled the most with trust, his anger running deeper than mine or Diane's, and there were times he'd snap at Roland over small things that carried the weight of decades. But there were also good moments that felt almost normal, like when Roland showed up at Diane's ultrasound appointment without being asked, sitting in the waiting room for 2 hours just to see the screen for 5 minutes. He called me one Tuesday to ask advice about a book he was reading, some business biography that reminded him of his early dealership days, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing important. He texted Jason a meme about baseball that was actually funny, and Jason texted back a laughing emoji, and that tiny exchange felt like progress. We were learning how to be a family, instead of just people related by blood and shared trauma, and it was awkward and uncomfortable, but also real in a way we'd never experienced before. Roland started showing up for things, not with money or grand gestures, but with his actual presence, and that mattered more than I expected it to. Roland sold 2 of his dealerships in April, a decision that shocked everyone who knew him because those dealerships were profitable, and he'd built them from nothing. But he told us he didn't need 17 dealerships, didn't need to keep expanding his empire, and the money from the sale could do more good somewhere else. He used it to set up a foundation for children of low-income families, providing school supplies, clothes, emergency funds for medical bills or housing crises, all the things we'd needed as kids that he never provided. He named it after his mother, the woman who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't keep them fed, and he asked if we'd serve on the board with him. The request felt significant, like he was inviting us into something meaningful, instead of just throwing money at a problem. It felt like he was trying to heal his own childhood while making amends to us, giving other kids what he wished he'd had and what he should have given us. We all agreed to join the board, even Jason, who remained skeptical about Roland's motivations, and we started meeting monthly to review applications and distribute funds. The work brought us together regularly in a way that felt purposeful, and I watched Roland interact with the families we helped with genuine emotion. He sat across from a single mother who needed money for her kid's winter coat and school supplies, and his eyes got wet when she thanked him. He talked to the kids with a gentleness I'd never experienced from him, asking about their favorite subjects and what they wanted to be when they grew up, actually listening to their answers. Jason pointed out the irony one day after a board meeting, how Roland could be generous with strangers' children but couldn't with his own, and Roland didn't defend himself or explain. He just said he was trying to be better, that he couldn't change the past, but he could do different things now, and Jason nodded slowly, like maybe that was enough. I kept seeing Rose every other week, working through the complicated feelings of watching my father change while grieving the father I needed as a child. She helped me understand that both feelings could exist at the same time, that I could appreciate who Roland was becoming while still being angry about who he was when I needed him most. The revenge with the fake investment fund had given me power temporarily, a sense of control and satisfaction watching him beg for access to something that didn't exist. But forgiveness was giving me something more lasting, something that felt like actual relationship instead of just satisfaction. Rose explained that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It meant choosing to move forward without letting the anger control everything. I wasn't sure I'd fully forgiven Roland yet, wasn't sure that was even possible, but I was learning to exist in the space between anger and acceptance. The therapy sessions helped me see that what I actually wanted wasn't revenge or even apology, but connection, and that required letting go of the need to punish him forever. 6 months after I'd confessed about the fake fund, we had our first family gathering that felt genuinely normal. We met at Roland's house for dinner, no special occasion or therapy requirement, just the 4 of us eating together. The conversation flowed naturally without the forced quality of earlier attempts, and there was actual laughter that didn't feel uncomfortable or weird. Roland told a story about his early dealership days when he accidentally ordered 200 cars instead of 20 because he misread a form and he made it funny instead of using it to brag about his business skills. He laughed at himself, at his younger self's panic and stupidity, and it felt self-deprecating in a way he'd never been before. Jason made a joke about Roland's cooking improving since the lasagna disaster, and Roland laughed genuinely instead of getting defensive, and the ease of it made something relax in my shoulders. Diane caught my eye across the table and smiled, and I realized this was what we'd been fighting for all along. Not revenge, not punishment, not even apology, but this ordinary moment of family dinner where people actually liked each other. It felt simple and profound at the same time, like we'd finally found something worth having. Roland asked at the end of that dinner if we could make these family gatherings a monthly tradition, and he wanted to rotate houses so he wasn't always the host. He said he wanted to see how we lived, wanted to be part of our regular lives instead of just the wealthy father in the big empty house. The next month, he came to my apartment with bags of groceries and ingredients for dinner, and we cooked together in my tiny kitchen that was nothing like his expensive one. We made pasta from scratch, flour covering the counter in our hands, talking about everything and nothing while we worked. He asked about my job and actually listened to my answer, asked about Sarah and when he might meet her properly, told me about an article he'd read about emerging markets that made him think of me. It was ordinary in the best possible way, just 2 people making dinner and talking, and I kept waiting for it to feel weird or forced, but it didn't. We ate at my small table with mismatched chairs, and Roland said the pasta was better than anything at the expensive restaurants he used to take clients to, and I believed him. Diane went into labor on a Tuesday morning in October, and Roland was at the hospital within an hour of getting the call. He sat in the waiting room with me and Jason, pacing and nervous like any grandfather would be, his expensive watch forgotten on his wrist. When the nurse finally came to get us, Roland walked into that hospital room and saw his granddaughter for the first time, and his face transformed completely. Diane held the baby out to him, and he took her with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, looking at this tiny person like she was the most precious thing he'd ever seen. He told Diane she was going to be an amazing mother, that watching her hold her daughter showed him everything he'd missed by being so emotionally absent with us. He said watching us become parents were teaching him what he should have been, and he was grateful we were giving him a chance to be present now, to be the grandfather he should have been a father. Diane cried too, and Jason put his hand on Roland's shoulder, and I stood there watching my father hold his granddaughter and thought about how far we'd traveled from that night at Diane's wedding when I started planning revenge. The therapy session 3 weeks later felt different from the start. Jason sat in the chair with his arms crossed tight against his chest, his jaw clenched in that way that meant he was holding something back. Rose noticed immediately and asked him what was on his mind. He shook his head at first, said nothing, but Roland was watching him with this expression I'd never seen before, like he was bracing himself for whatever was coming. Rose waited, patient like always, and finally Jason's face crumpled and he started talking about being 15 years old with a broken tooth. He described delivering pizzas in the rain, counting tips at the end of each shift, calculating how many more weeks until he could afford the dental work. His voice cracked when he said the worst part wasn't the physical pain, but coming home to see Roland's new Porsche in the driveway, knowing his father could have fixed his tooth with pocket change but chose not to. He looked directly at Roland and said he felt worthless, like he wasn't worth the cost of basic care, and that feeling never really went away even now as an adult. The room went completely silent. Roland's hands were shaking in his lap. He opened his mouth twice before any words came out, and when they did, there was no explanation or justification, just a simple acknowledgement that he had failed Jason, and it was wrong. Jason started crying, real sobbing that shook his whole body, and Roland asked quietly if he could hug him. Jason nodded, and they held each other in the middle of Rose's office, while decades of accumulated pain started to crack open and drain out. I watched my brother and father embrace for what might have been the first time in 20 years and felt my own throat tighten with emotion I didn't know how to name. Rose told us the following week that our family had made remarkable progress, but she warned that healing wasn't a straight line and we should expect setbacks. She was right about that. There were still moments when Roland would say something that triggered one of us, when his old patterns of thinking would emerge in small ways, when the trust between us felt as thin and breakable as glass. One night at dinner, he made an offhand comment about financial responsibility, and Jason went completely quiet, his face shutting down in that familiar way. But instead of letting the moment destroy everything, we talked through it. Roland caught himself, apologized, explained what he'd actually meant versus how it had sounded. Jason told him why the comment hurt, and Roland listened without getting defensive. It was messy and uncomfortable, but we were learning to work through these moments instead of letting them pile up into walls between us. The fragility didn't scare me as much anymore because I was starting to believe we could handle it. Roland started showing up at Jason's amateur baseball games in April. Jason played in a weekend league for guys who still loved the sport, but never went pro, and Roland had never attended a single game when Jason played in high school. Jason acted like it didn't matter when Roland first asked if he could come, shrugging and saying sure in this casual way that didn't match the tension in his shoulders. I went to that first game too, and watched Roland sit in the stands wearing jeans and a regular shirt, cheering when Jason came up to bat. Jason hit a home run in the 5th inning, and I saw his face transform as he rounded the bases, this huge grin breaking through as he heard Roland shouting his name from the stands. After the game, Roland walked up to Jason and told him he was proud of him, and Jason stood there for a second before saying it was the first time he'd heard those words. They hugged again, shorter this time, but just as meaningful, and I realized these small, ordinary moments were building something we'd never had before. Diane's birthday came in early June, and Roland showed up at her house with a wrapped package that looked handmade rather than store-bought. She opened it to find a photo album he'd put together himself, filled with pictures from her childhood that he'd dug out of storage and organized chronologically. Each page had a note in his handwriting about a specific memory, things he treasured about her that he'd never told her. She cried reading his note about her determination and strength, qualities he'd always admired but kept to himself because he thought acknowledging them would make her soft. She told him through tears that this meant more than any amount of money ever could, and he said he was starting to understand that the expensive gifts he used to give were really just ways to avoid actual emotional connection. They sat together on her couch going through the album page by page, and I heard them laughing about some of the old photos, remembering moments from a childhood that had been harder than it should have been, but still held some good memories worth keeping. I introduced Roland to Sarah in July, nervous about how he'd act even though he'd been doing so much better. We met at a casual restaurant, nothing fancy, and I watched Roland shake her hand and ask genuine questions about her work as a teacher. He wanted to know about her students, her approach to education, what she found most rewarding about the job. Sarah relaxed as the conversation went on, and I could see her surprise at how different he was from the stories I'd told her. After dinner, Roland pulled me aside while Sarah was in the bathroom and told me she seemed wonderful, and he was happy I'd found someone who clearly loved me. It was the kind of fatherly approval I'd never thought I'd experience, this simple acknowledgement that he cared about my happiness and wanted good things for me. Sarah said later that she'd expected someone cold and distant based on my stories, but the man she met seemed genuinely interested in building a relationship with her. I told her people could change if they were willing to do the work, and I was still getting used to believing that myself. A year after I'd confessed about legacy partners, we gathered at Roland's house for Christmas, and the atmosphere was completely different from every holiday I remembered. There was actual warmth in the rooms, laughter that sounded genuine instead of forced, conversations that went beyond surface pleasantries into real connection. Roland gave each of us gifts that showed he'd been paying attention to our actual lives instead of just buying expensive items to show off his wealth. He gave Jason a signed baseball from his favorite player's rookie year, something Jason had mentioned wanting months ago in passing. He gave Diane a first edition of her favorite childhood book with an inscription about how watching her read to her daughter reminded him of moments he'd missed. He gave me a framed photo of us from when I was 5, one of the few pictures where he was actually smiling at me instead of at the camera. The gifts weren't about the money spent, but about the thought and attention behind them, and that shift felt more significant than any apology. Roland gathered us in the living room after we'd opened presents and said he'd been thinking about his legacy, what he wanted to leave behind when he was gone. He said he'd spent his whole life building car dealerships and accumulating money, But he realized now that none of that mattered as much as the relationships he'd almost destroyed through his fear and selfishness. He told us he was updating his will to include substantial donations to causes we each cared about, things that reflected our values rather than his desire to be remembered as wealthy. He wanted us involved in those decisions, not because it was our money, but because he wanted to build something meaningful together that would outlast him. Jason asked why this mattered now when he'd never cared about our input before. And Roland said honestly that facing his own mortality at 73 made him realize he didn't want to die alone in his big empty house, surrounded by expensive things that meant nothing. He wanted to die knowing he'd contributed to something bigger than himself and that his children didn't hate him. Jason announced his engagement to his girlfriend Amanda in February, and Roland's response showed how much he'd changed. He asked if he could contribute to the wedding, not to show off or control everything, but because he wanted to be part of this important moment in Jason's life. Jason agreed after talking it through with Amanda, and they sat down together to plan a budget that respected Jason's choices while allowing Roland to help in meaningful ways. Roland didn't try to upgrade everything or push for a more expensive venue. He just listened to what Jason and Amanda wanted and figured out how he could support that vision. At the wedding in May, Roland's speech was about Jason's strength and character, the resilience he'd developed through all the hardship Roland had put him through, and how proud he was to watch Jason build a life based on genuine love and partnership instead of fear and isolation. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, and afterward several people told me they'd never seen a father of the groom speech that honest and vulnerable. Diane's daughter Sophia took her first steps at a family dinner in June, wobbling across the living room carpet while we all watched and cheered. Roland was there to see it, sitting on the floor with his arms outstretched, encouraging Sophia to walk to him. Diane stood behind Sophia with her hands hovering protectively, and I saw her face when Roland scooped Sophia up and kissed her forehead with such obvious love and joy. Later that evening, Roland told Diane she was the kind of mother he wished he'd had growing up, and watching her parent with such patience and unconditional love was teaching him things he'd missed during his own childhood and our childhoods. Diane said having him as an involved grandfather was healing something she didn't even know was broken, this hole where a loving father should have been, that was slowly filling in through his relationship with Sophia. Rose told me in what turned out to be our final therapy session that what our family had accomplished was rare, that most estrangements don't heal because someone isn't willing to do the work required. She said the legacy partner's revenge had been a catalyst that forced honesty when nothing else would have broken through Roland's defenses, and while she didn't recommend that approach in general, in our specific case it had led to something real and transformative. I told her I was grateful for the relationship I had with Roland now, this growing connection built on honesty and effort, even though I still grieved the father I'd needed as a child and would never have. She said both feelings could exist together, that healing didn't erase the past, but created space for something different in the present. I left her office feeling like I'd reached some kind of resolution, not perfect or complete, but real enough to build on. 2 years after everything started, I'm at Roland's house helping him organize his home office. The room is still too big, still has the expensive furniture he bought to prove something to himself, but now it feels different somehow. We're going through filing cabinets, sorting decades of business records and personal papers into keep and shred piles. I pull open a drawer in his desk and find the Legacy Partners brochure I created, the glossy paper still smooth and professional looking. The fake company logo I designed stares back at me, and I hold it up without saying anything. Roland looks over from where he's boxing up old tax documents, and his face changes when he sees what I'm holding. We both start laughing at the same time, this genuine shared laughter that would have been impossible 3 years ago. He takes the brochure from me and examines it like it's some kind of historical document, shaking his head at the elaborate details I included. The fake board member photos, the projected returns that seemed so believable, the entire hereditary invitation system designed specifically to exploit his weakness for exclusive access. He tells me he's almost grateful for it because his pride would never have let him admit he needed to change without being completely broken first. Sometimes you have to lose everything to figure out what actually matters, he says, and I realize he's talking about more than just the fake investment fund. We keep sorting through his office, but the mood has shifted into something comfortable and easy. He asks if I think he's a good father now, and the question catches me off guard because Roland never used to ask for validation or approval about anything. I tell him honestly that he's a much better father than he was, and that's what matters. I explain that I'm learning to appreciate who he is now, while accepting that I can't get back the childhood I needed. The 14-year-old working at Subway will always be part of me, and no amount of present-day connection can erase those years of feeling worthless to him. He sits down in his desk chair and says, "That's fair, and more grace than he probably deserves," and I realize he's finally learned humility. The man who used to show us his portfolio at dinner and brag about earning every cent without help can now admit he was wrong. We finish organizing his office and head downstairs for coffee, and he tells me about a call he got from Jason yesterday just to chat about nothing important. Our family isn't perfect, and there are still complicated feelings and occasional tensions that surface without warning. Last month, Jason got angry when Roland offered to help with his mortgage payment, old patterns rising up before we talked through it. Diane sometimes gets quiet during family dinners when certain topics come up, and I can see her remembering her wedding and that horrible speech. But we're building something real based on honesty and effort, instead of pretending the past didn't happen. Roland calls regularly just to check in, not about business or money, but about our actual lives. He shows up for important moments like Jason's work promotion celebration and Diane's daughter's first birthday party. He genuinely cares about our lives beyond our ability to be self-sufficient, asking about my relationship with Sarah and remembering details from previous conversations. He's learning that love isn't about withholding help to build character, but about showing up consistently and caring deeply about the people who matter. At our monthly family dinner the following week, I look around the table at Roland laughing with Jason about something that happened at the dealership. Diane is nursing her daughter Sophia while talking to Sarah about some book they both read. The table is crowded with food that everyone contributed, not expensive steakhouse meals, but normal family dinner dishes. Roland is 74 now, and while we can't get back the lost years, we're making the most of the time we have left. Sarah squeezes my hand under the table, and I realize this is what I wanted all along. Not revenge, but family. The Legacy Partners scheme was cruel, and I'm not proud of how far I took it, but it broke through decades of dysfunction to create space for something healthier. We're building a relationship based on who we actually are instead of who we wished we'd been, and that feels like enough.